concert because
You
I
did?
wanted to see.
Yes.
I couldn't get it to work.
Oh, no. No, here's the thing.
That was the thing.
Oh, I can send you. Yes, I'll find it.
Those happy reasons.
No. Yeah, no, I'll find it on the sheet.
Only because
There's an
I
easy way.
got my cousin
Yeah.
and he came because of you.
Yeah. Oh,
And
I was sick.
and it was wailing in the back. So I said, I wanted my chance to hear your voice. Because less than a family it wasn't of a sound, which I wanted my husband to hear specifically this particular sound and language.
Thank you. I can. It's difficult. There's a picture very simple.
Private language.
Yes, which I will send you.
Thank you. I just wanted him to have a chance. Because we had a lot of discussions about the language and the this.
I'm so out of it right now. Thank you.
Sort of the that I wanted him to hear. As I told him, I heard you hear that this was a particular sound.
You know, that's
And then the video mentioned that which is actually I don't want to be right up front.
one of the reasons I did
Because we're leaving early.
concerts before I get to an age is because there's a particular place
Yeah. It's rare. It's a rare, to me, it's a rare sound that I think you need a overture and life experience to bring to it something that gives you a sense of context and place.
it's interesting.
And he did everything, I'm sure, flawlessly. But what he didn't have was the life experience or the links to others you had spoken with, either your father or the everything that you know, wherein their experience comes in and through your own. And we're becoming so far away from some young people. Don't get more back. I don't anymore. When I used to be at air shows, people would with a World War II aircraft, and people would go, oh, so did you know this? Yes. That was World War II. I'm a female. I don't know what. I mean, just that
It's really interesting. It's one of the woman Paulina who said
which one was she? Was she the one from Russia?
yes.
Okay, yeah.
Black
Because we went to her free concert.
There are different ways of saying this. You need access to exactly what you're talking about. She was born in Siberia, Russia, and now her husband a dozen foreign countries. Yeah, that's her husband.
And he brought something very special to me. And real quick, like presents.
It depends how you do it. My sister is, there's, I don't know what to call it. There's then there's a different kind of very argument, subtle, joyous.
It spoke of the minaret, it spoke of the drums,
He's
the way
into
that sound goes through that air is so different. And if you've not, context again, if you've not been there and sort of felt, only that is ingrained.
Oh.
Do you know,
I remember
there are
that
a few
film. I love
places
that.
in there
Yeah.
where the music got very close.
Merlin
I hate to say it, terrible.
tries, I mean, you're noticing something that probably a lot of people didn't consciously. He is very influenced to do something. Which is very Thursday migrated, as I
my mistake, are staying there and taking the final
I have to say that compared to my
they make sure that it's pretty.
Yeah. It's so interesting.
Tracy has a deal with
We did in St. Martin in the Field.
Sierra Mom in XYZ.
Can you imagine? There's at St. Martin, the model is like in the middle. So there's the
Been a while.
the prime, they call it the narthex, and the long aisle. This is the middle. He's got up there.
5 to 8 years ago, somewhere in there.
Unbelievable. One has to assume that they've never been buried before in that church for 30 years. I don't know that for sure.
to have added that sound. To me, it's almost, even though the cathedral walls are made of concrete,
They're talking. I mean,
every sound that's ever happened, and it's part of its indigenous national. And it's counterintuitive, she's bouncing off the concrete.
No, it absorbs the spirit.
And the
It's a big guess, like, you know, when you're in a space like that, or saying just anywhere, you're
just move on to whatever.
spirits of everybody who's been there, but because of the nature of the space and what people do with healing, you're so right. It was astonishing.
I saw that when they wait.
we're going to
For this new,
I'm not going to pull the tent, so to speak, but let him be in the space and to experience the surrounded by trees and there's gatherers and dog walkers that are by them.
it's a program where gatherers and dog walkers can add something almost. It's a very rustic program. They aren't. So I'm writing a note, I'm not being rude, but I just want to make sure I say.
Happy with the sea.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
That'll be easy.
Yes.
R-E-Z-O-S.
That I did.
That makes the sound. The key is how long you have to stay away.
So she said, what is it there? So I said, talk to your husband today and say that you want to walk to Costa Rica. Let's check if it's random or...
The thing that I'm very interested in is part of the deal.
So I said, change them to some place and you said,
You should have it. 1 minute. You're more than welcome.
Whatever we all do, the strategic specific
Started away with it.
now, that's not the same. they're like the contract. It's cheaper for me as a director. There is a guy and I would love to set up Jake Kaufman. Or I'm only really I just want to play about which I know nothing. She keeps things separate.
know a lot of things. That's why I said to her, so I
What I can tell you is she mentioned this is not I'm sorry that I just said
Thank you for telling me. I never lie. Thank you so much. Yeah, right. It's gotten a lot of press. You know it?
I saw it on the video. It's London. Latest play, and I says probably he's been doing it for
Yeah, it's true. How many careers continue like that? So
morning, everybody. Nice to see you. Shabbat Shalom. So glad to see everybody on this beautiful late May morning. So great to see the sun and a blue sky, isn't it? Okay, so welcome to those who are live streaming. Who picked up the bagels this morning? I forgot to check. Patty, thank you so much. Patty is really one of our premier picker-uppers. Isn't it true? Yeah. There are degrees of excellence. Everybody does it well. Let's say that. All right, blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Jean.
Who paid for the bagels in the street?
Yeah, who paid for the bagels? I was trying to avoid that because I didn't look.
Nancy Bronson.
I'm sorry?
Nancy Bronson.
Nancy Bronson
She's not here.
paid for the bagels, and who did live streaming?
Nancy.
Nancy did as well? Let's assume it.
Scott did the bagel.
Okay. Scott did the bagels? Oh, Scott did the bagels.
Highly recommend them.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you. That was a joint effort to get that information out. Excellent. Jean's raising her hand here before we started reminded me of, some of you remember Ernie Siegler? Who used to sit right there where Kathy is sitting. And about this time when I said good morning, Shabbat Shalom, welcome, Ernie had his hand up. I said, Ernie, we don't have any material yet. What's the question? He always had a question, even before we got started. And I do remember that. He was such a dear guy, and we miss him. Okay, so here we are in the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Torah. We've already started the book of Numbers. The word Numbers comes from the Greek and Latin tradition. There is this idea in the Talmud as well. Chomesh HaPekudim, the fifth of counting. Chomesh, the fifth, 1/5 of the 5 books of Moses. So this notion of counting, of numbering, which is the English name for it, and for obvious reasons, we have a variety of censuses. And that's what raises a nice question. Is census a fourth declension Latin noun, for which the plural is the same as the singular, I believe? But we can say censuses. So there's several examples of counting in the book of Numbers at the very beginning and at the end as the people get ready to move forward. And so there's a kind of reckoning of what there is, the tribes, the individuals, the gifts, the furnishing of the sanctuary, the mustering or the preparation for mustering of an army. The Hebrew name of the book by which we understand it, Bamidbar, is also descriptive. Both names are descriptive because these are the episodes that take place in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. So we've been looking at a variety of interesting passages in the first 10 chapters, which continues and concludes the priestly materials in the book of Numbers. And in the middle of chapter 10, we then see that the people are ready to move on, where Moses addresses his father-in-law, and we'll get to that today perhaps, and then they begin to move. And the first thing that happens after that preparation for moving is chapter 11, the people took to complaining bitterly. And so this is the beginning of a series of episodes in the middle of the book of Numbers where the people resist moving forward. Kind of, we might call it the counter-revolution. The idea brought forward by Michael Walzer in his wonderful book, Exodus and Revolution. So we have the revolution, so to speak, the forward march to the promised land with all of its promise and peril. And we have those who are, quite understandably, this is, how to say this? One could say this is the opposition of the good guys and the bad guys. The ones who are going to move forward and the ones who don't want to move forward. But I think that would be unfair because I think these stories, in some surgical way, represent the difficulties of moving forward with all of its indecisiveness, all of its mystery. And so to be able to move forward into an unknown future, even though God has said this is the land, is fraught with peril. And therefore it's psychologically appropriate and profound to recognize that people really want to do what they're used to doing, and the physical comforts, which are tangible, predictable, constant, may feel much more inviting than the unknown for all of its idealism, the promised land, the land of milk and honey, where we're going to be able to live by our own understanding and our own values. So I think that these stories in the middle of the book of Numbers really point out the complexities of moving forward into a somewhat unknown future. But we are still at the beginning of the book of Numbers in priestly territory, which, as you may remember, begins in Exodus chapter 25 with the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness. The last 16 chapters of Exodus, climaxing in the cloud hovering over the Mishkan, filling the Holy of Holies so Moses can't get in. And then we turn immediately to the beginning of Leviticus, where God invites Moses to come in. So the last 16 chapters of Exodus, all 27 chapters of Leviticus deal with priestly material, not all of it ritual, because the main idea in the book of Leviticus is holiness. And there are two ways of being holy according to the book of Leviticus, through ritual and through ethical behavior. And so the last chapters deal with ethical behavior. And then we have the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers. And so we're about to conclude that middle section. And when you think about it, when we think about the 5 books of Moses, we tend to think about the narrative. But really, when you think about it, 10 plus 27 plus 16, 43, 53 chapters of the 5 books of Moses. Somebody want to figure out how many chapters there are in the 5 books of Moses? 50 plus 40 is 90, and 27 is 117, and 36, what is that? What's that?
153.
And then Deuteronomy 34. So what is that? 187, very good. So 53 out of almost a third of the book of the 5 books of Moses deals with ritual matters. And we don't really think in those terms, do we, when we think about what the contents of the 5 books of Moses are, from creation to the death of Moses. So it's an interesting reality, I think. So I want to look at several interesting passages in these climactic or final priestly chapters. So let's turn first to chapter 7. I have brought my Robert Alter. Some of you have Alter's now completed 3 volumes of the Tanakh, Torah, Prophets, Writings. It's a bargain at $75. But this is the first volume, which he published over many, many years, those 3 volumes. So, chapter 7, beginning with verse 12, the one who presented his offering on the first day was Nachshon, the son of Amminadab. So Nachshon is the representative of the tribe of Judah, and the Midrash makes a great deal out of Nachshon, who, when the Israelites were stalled at the Red Sea and didn't want to move forward, according to the Midrash, Nachshon jumped in first and got the process started. It's just another way in which the prestige and the preeminence of the tribe of Judah is emphasized from the very, very, very beginning. And of course that leads to King David, who is from the tribe of Judah. So the one who presented his offering, verse 12, on the first day was Nachshon, the son of Amminadab of the tribe of Judah. And his offering, 1 silver bowl weighing 130 shekels, and 1 silver basin of 70 shekels, and so on. This section goes on from verse 12 to verse 88. And Alter makes a very interesting comment on this, which I want to read. He says here about, and his comment is on verses 12 through 88. So he's making one long comment on many, many verses. This is the one signal instance in the entire Bible of extensive verbatim repetition without the slightest variation. And then he points out an illustration of that. Biblical narrative, as we have had many occasions to see, characteristically deploys significant swerves from verbatim repetition as it approximately repeats strings of phrases and whole clauses and sentences. So when the Torah repeats, it engages in some variations so as not to be boring. This passage, he says, however, is manifestly not narrative, but a kind of epic inventory. Each of the tribes here accorded absolutely equal status before the sanctuary without political hierarchy, brings exactly the same offering. Okay, so he's made 2 interesting observations about this, essentially very apparently dull passage. Epic inventory and the utter parity of all the tribes. And when we think of the tribes, we think of a kind of hierarchy, don't we? The Judah tribes, the Rachel tribes, Benjamin and Joseph on the one hand, the Levites on the other, and so on. One can readily imagine that the members of each tribe in the ancient audience of this text would be expected to relish the sumptuousness of its own tribal offering, exactly equal to all the others, as it hears the passage read. I like this, suggesting that in the ancient world, maybe before these passages were gathered into a canonical text, we had independent texts, one of which is this long repetitive passage, read in the presence of the tribes, where each tribe can celebrate its equality with every other tribe. So what Alter is also pointing to here is the apparent, probably obvious, oral background of the written tradition. It is also well to remember that lists and the repetitions they entail constitute an established literary form with its own aesthetic pleasures. As for example, in the catalog of the ships in the Iliad, or the cumulative, repetitive structures of songs like the Chagadia at Pesach. And more apposite to this catalog of gifts, on the 12 days of Christmas. How many Jewish-authored commentaries on Scripture bring in the 12 days of Christmas? But it's an extremely interesting observation, isn't it? The offerings of the tribes encompasses animal, vegetable, and mineral gifts, the sacrificial beasts, the grain offerings, the precious vessels, and are punctuated by the solemn stipulation of weight and number. Okay? So I like the adjective here, solemn. So this itself is a kind of ritualized composite, read with, I might say, a crescendo of power through the repetition alone. In other words, if you're like me, when I come to a passage like this, I read the first verse, the second verse, I look on a little bit, I see that it's repeated, I read on a little bit more, oh, it's repeated again, the heck with it. I skip it, I move on, because nothing is duller than a long repetitive list, except in the hands of a scholar like Robert Alter, who brings forward its pageantry, its aesthetic pleasures, the equality of the tribes, the solemnity, and really it is a kind of illustration of what ritual is. One of the features of ritual is repetition, isn't it? We do it over and over again, the familiarity of what we've read, the familiarity of the sequence. If we've done it over and over again and it becomes kind of a part of us, it gives us an opportunity on a subsequent occasion to think a little bit more deeply about it or to think of it afresh. I've had a very interesting day. I come to the Kabbalat Shabbat service. Certain things are on my mind from my day. And those things on that particular day can serve as a kind of vehicle, a prism, through which I understand afresh, or for really the first time, something I had never seen before. It's the function of repetition, isn't it? We see it in music, we see it in poetry. So those elements which give form and therefore coherence to material. Vivian?
Also, in its rhythm and repetition, I can imagine one could commit it to memory.
Yeah.
If it were in its oral tradition.
Yeah.
Like a partridge in a pear tree, everyone joins in.
Yeah. I was just reading this morning in the paper, maybe you saw it, an op-ed piece on the Succession series. It's a wonderful piece in the New York Times, if you haven't had a chance. And he points to the power of, because he's talking about how will it end. And he's talking about the power of certain endings, and he reminds us of the end of The Great Gatsby. So we beat back boats against the current, born, ceaseless, all the alliterations which help us to remember, and so on, so that we take it inside of us. It's not just external to us. That's a nice observation. All right, so all this then, he continues, Baruch Levine, a commentator on this, notes, moreover, the certain similarities in form with various West Semitic temple inventories that have been uncovered by archaeologists. So it's another observation that this kind of passage has precedence in the ancient Near Eastern world, so that the Tanakh, in a way, is created not in a vacuum, but in a wider cultural context from which it borrows. We know, I think the most famous example is the flood story, the epic of Gilgamesh, which is really a quest for immortality, whereas the flood story in the Bible, obviously knowing about the Epic of Gilgamesh and other flood stories, both repeats and changes. The Noah story is not about the search for immortality, but for the recognition of goodness, of moral goodness. Noah walks with God, and so on. So it's a nice example of borrowing from a background, but transforming its elements in the light of the premises of that particular society. So here we have it again. Baruch Levine notes, moreover, certain similarities in forms with various West Semitic temple inventories that have been uncovered by archaeologists. In the Hebrew, for example, the ordinal numbers uncharacteristically follow the nouns rather than precede them, and so on. This entire passage, like almost all of the first 10 chapters of Numbers, is the product of priestly writers, and it strongly reflects both their professional concerns and the literary antecedents on which they drew. I think a wonderful, wonderful, illuminating comment. Let's take a look at chapter 8. Notice we're skipping all the repetitions now. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you mount the lamps," set up the lamps, "let the 7 lamps give light at the front of the lampstand." Aaron did so. He mounted the lamps at the front of the lampstand as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now this is the lampstand which was made, and now it's described. And Alter has an interesting comment on this passage. So, let's see now. What does he say here? So he says here, Rashi provides a vividly imaginative explanation for why this unit of 4 verses about the lampstand should immediately follow the dedicatory offering of the 12 tribes. Okay? So Rashi wonders why at this point, after all these repetitions of the tribes, we now get something about Aaron. When Aaron saw, and so on. When Aaron saw the dedicatory here's Rashi's comment. When Aaron saw the dedicatory offering of the chieftains, he was dismayed that he was not together with them in the dedicatory offering, neither he nor his tribe. The Holy One said to him, "By your life, yours is greater than theirs, for you light and tend to the lamps." So Rashi's comment is, why is Aaron introduced here? Because Aaron's tribe, evidently, or partial tribe, is not mentioned in the list, and so we have to bring Aaron in, and he has a special task which is preeminent. He is able to light the lamps. Let's look at verse 19 of chapter 8. "And from among the Israelites, I formally assign the Levites to Aaron and his sons, to perform the service for the Israelites in the tent of meeting, and to make expiation for the Israelites, so that no plague may afflict the Israelites for coming too near the sanctuary." The function of the Levites to protect, as shomrim, both in terms of making sure that the various elements are intact, but also to protect it from assault from without. Moses, Aaron, and the whole Israelite community did with the Levites accordingly. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses in regard to the Levites, so the Israelites did with them. The Levites purified themselves, washed their clothes, and Aaron designated them as an elevation offering before the Lord. And Aaron made expiation for them to cleanse them. Alter has another comment that though there is no notion of original sin in the Hebrew Scriptures, there is a notion of original impurity. And for those who deal with the pure elements, the ritual, the sacrifices, have to be made pure in order to be elevated to that office. Aaron made expiation, in the middle of verse 21, for them to cleanse them. Thereafter the Levites were qualified to perform their service in the tent of meeting under Aaron and his sons. As the Lord had commanded Moses in regard to the Levites, so they did to them. Again, this tripartite hierarchy. God commands Moses, who then imparts that commandment to the people, and if everything is in order, they do what they're commanded to do. Verse 23, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this is the rule for the Levites. From 25 years of age up, they shall participate in the workforce and the service of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50, they shall retire from the workforce and shall serve no more. Okay? 25 to 50. Okay? And then, it's time to step back. They may assist their brother Levites at the tent of meeting by standing guard, but they shall perform no labor. That's interesting. I think, for example, of surgeons who at a certain point probably need to retire because their hands, let's say, are not as flexible, dexterous. But they can still go down to hospitals and serve non-surgical roles, continuing their profession. So here the Levites, who no longer are engaged in the labor, can certainly serve fellow Levites who are younger as advisors. They may assist their brother Levites at the tent of meeting by standing guard, but they shall perform no labor. Thus you shall deal with the Levites in regard to their duties. I do want to read another altar piece again on this. And it's on verse 19. I made the Levites wholly given to Aaron and to his sons. He says here, although given is not repeated as above, an analogous emphasis is contained by the cognate verb made. This is the first clear indication of a hierarchical division of cultic labor between the Aaronite priests, the Kohanim, and the Levites. So we know in Jewish life that every individual, whether he or she knows it or not, is either a Kohen, a Levite, or an Israelite. The Israelites are the common people. Okay? Here, Alter is suggesting that division is first articulated. This is the first clear indication of a hierarchical division of cultic labor between the Aaronite priests and the Levites, who serve them and do the heavy lifting in the sanctuary, the work, in contrast to officiating in the ritual. A Levine, Baruch Levine again, conjectures that historically this division between the Levites and the priests began only at the time of Josiah's reforms around 621 before the Common Era. Levine's speculating that it happens just at the moment when Josiah, the greatest king, is the king, and when Deuteronomy was discovered in the temple, or Proto-Deuteronomy. And what's interesting is that Deuteronomy doesn't know this distinction. It's only Levites. So it's curious that one scholar thinks that this division was first inaugurated at that very time. But we know of that distinction, and here it is. The Aaronites do the ritual, and the Levites are the laborers in the sanctuary. Let's go to chapter 9, verse 15. On that day, the tabernacle was set up. The cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the pact. And in the evening it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until morning. It was always so. The cloud covered it, appearing as fire by night. And whenever the cloud lifted from the tent, the Israelites would set out accordingly. In other words, I mean, it's quite obvious, but let me just repeat it. The movements of the cloud determine whether the people stay where they are or they rest. If the cloud covers it, they stay. If it's lifted, it's time to move on. In other words, the trip is divinely guided and not humanly initiated, at least here. At the spot where the cloud settled, there the Israelites would make camp. At a command of the Lord, the Israelites broke camp, and at a command of the Lord, they made camp. And they remained encamped as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle. When the cloud lingered over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites observed the Lord's mandate and did not journey on. In other words, compliance, going along with the plan. So here the Israelites are behaving in the right way. We'll see, starting with chapter 11, that they resist and continue to. At such times, verse 20, as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, but for a few days, they remained in camp at the command of the Lord, and broke camp at the command of the Lord. And at such times as the cloud stayed from evening until morning, they broke camp as soon as the cloud lifted in the morning, day or night. Whenever the cloud lifted, they would break camp. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, however long the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, the Israelites remained encamped and did not set out. Only when it lifted did they break camp. On a side from the Lord, they made camp. On a side from the Lord, they broke camp. They observed the Lord's mandate as the Lord's bidding. Let me see what Alter has to say on this. This literary unit, he said, which I've just read, nicely sets the stage for the peregrinations and the perturbations, the movements and the difficulties that will make up much of the book of Numbers from chapter 10 onward. Until this point, the forward drive of the narrative has been abandoned for tabulation, census, and military roster, and legislation in a long stasis in the wilderness of Sinai. Now the Israelites prepare to move on, and their order of march, dictated by the descent upon the tabernacle and the ascent from the tabernacle of the divine cloud, is reported in a series of verbs in the iterative sense, one thing representing many things. The indication of the varying time periods during which the cloud abides over the tabernacle may seem repetitious, but in fact constitutes a grand rhetorical flourish. All of the Israelites' movements through the wilderness are prompted by the divine sign, and the duration of encampment varying from a night or two to a month to a year. One scholar neatly confirms the purposeful rhetorical organization of the passage by pointing to its studied use of numerically formulated repetitions. So the idea, once again, not just of content, but the presentation of the content to give a sense of how enormous a series of events is about to take place, and how the people must have felt on edge as they're about to move forward. Let's now go to chapter 10. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Have 2 silver trumpets made, make them of hammered work. They shall serve you to summon the community and to set the divisions in motion. When both are blown in long blasts, the whole community shall assemble for you at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And if only one is blown, the chieftains, heads of the Israelite contingent, shall assemble before you. But when you sound short blasts, the divisions encamped on the east shall move forward. And when you sound short blasts a second time, and so on and so on." what is interesting about this? We've just read that the movements will be initiated by God and only by God. And now it seems to want to offer a kind of complementary understanding that the blasts of the horns, humanly generated, are going to also be responsible for the motion. Don't you think this is indicative of something powerful in Scripture itself? That God is at the head and leads, but human beings in their autonomy, in their imagination, in their strength, also promote the kinds of motions and activities that take place. In a sense, maybe you'll think this is an exaggeration, it's an expression of the covenant, that there are two autonomous agents in the movements of Scripture, God and human beings. I think a parade example of this is the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? When we read that epic, it's human beings who generate the activity, right? The brothers and Joseph, and that long test to which Joseph subjects the brothers. This is all humanly motivated. In a way, this is a secular story. God doesn't act at all in this story, at least directly. But when Joseph is confronted by the brothers at the end and he recognizes that reconciliation is required, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. All along, God was directing this activity so that we would end up with this reconciliation. That's a good example of the idea of double causation. God and human beings each move the story forward. Scott?
So I have a question. The way the author describes sort of this cloud being a preface to what's about to be written here, and as I guess to establish maybe some legitimacy, like you just said, who the author is and all this. Does he do a similar thing at the end of 7? There's that sort of almost inserted verse about, this is how God spoke to Moses, 89, 789. At the end of that long list you described, there's this seemingly inserted verse here that just says, by the way, is it a similar preface to what we just saw here in 9 and 10? Does the author describe that or not?
Are you saying that, is this a similar thing?
Yeah, or does the author ignore 89, or does he describe it the same way?
I don't know, actually. But what point are you making here? That
Well, I'm asking if that's the same. I'm not really making a point. I'm asking, is 789
right?
a preface to the separation of the duties of the Levites and the Kohens and everything, the same way that this the description of the movements and the complications and everything is a preface to that.
I think that's a good point, right? To introduce that God's role is prominent.
Yeah, right.
No, I think that's right. I mean, after all, we're going to move soon to a very human story. And when we do so, with all the murmurings and so on, of course, God reacts. But it's human beings that now generate it. So I think your idea is that especially as human beings are involved in generating the motion, that God's role is asserted as a kind of preface or a conclusion to it. Yeah, good. And we might say that this is editorial effort to take stories and to shape them over and against, let's call it a more general theology or philosophy of history. Good. Okay, Candy.
I just want to ask an easy question. Are Aaronites Kohanim or are they Levites?
The Aaronites are Kohanim, because Aaron is the Kohen Gadol, and only his immediate family get to be Kohanim. And the rest of so the Aaronites are a subset of the tribe of Levi.
The Aaronites are a
There's-
subset of the tribe.
Right.
That's why I.
So the Aaronites, the priests, and the Levites all come from the tribe of Levi. Okay?
Okay, what about Moses? Are his children around?
Are his children still around?
Are they with that?
I don't know. I don't know. That's an interesting point.
And maybe it doesn't matter, but.
It might not. Certainly Aaron's children matter a great deal. What we could do is we could go to a Bible dictionary and just look up who are his sons? Gershon
Siri
and who?
would know.
Sorry?
Siri would know.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah, to ask her, right.
Yeah, right. No, and Moses is also from the tribe of Levi. What's interesting is Leah, who is not Jacob's favorite, when he is given Leah on the wedding night, wakes up the next morning and says, "It's Leah," she gets the two most important tribes, Judah and Levi. So that in some ways there is a kind of recompense for her who is in a way pushed aside by Jacob's love for Rachel. Okay, let's look at chapter 10, verse, do we want to do that? Yeah, 10.
So are there any famous Kohanims? Any people named in the, I would think that there would be an important job. And
I just don't know much about the history. What we'd have to do is trace the history. There is a point at Solomon. There is Eli, who is a priest who, I just don't remember how it works out. But there is a contest between priestly houses, and Solomon votes for one of them. So there is a history of the priesthood, which itself is interesting, about which I know too little. Let's look at chapter 10, verse 11. In the second year, on the 20th day of the second month. So this is what? This is 35, this is a year and second year on the 20th day. So this is a year and 35 days after the Exodus from Egypt. So that all of this material which we've read from chapter 20 of Exodus through this moment is a very short space of time. We're at the very beginning now, and it looks like the people are ready to go into the promised land. But we know that through the story of the spies, it's then delayed 40 years. Okay, so in the second year, on the 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle of the pact, and the Israelites set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. The cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran. So they have been encamped all this time, which really isn't a great deal of time. But in terms of literary time, it looks like a long time, but they've been at Sinai all this time. When the march was to begin at the Lord's command through Moses, the first standards set out troop by troop, and what was the division of Judah. You remember that the tribes were encamped around the tabernacle, the portable Mishkan, with the Holy of Holies in the center, and the tribe of Judah and other tribes were on the east side of the array, and they therefore led the march. They're in the vanguard of the march. When the march, verse 13, was to begin, the Lord's command through Moses, the first standard set out troop by troop, the division of Judah. In command of its troops was Nachshon, the son of Amminadab. In command of the tribe of the troop of Issachar, Netanael, and Zebulun, 3 Leah tribes. Then the tabernacle would be taken apart. The Gershonites and the Merarites, Levite tribes, who carried the tabernacle, would set out. The next standard set out troop by troop was the division of Reuben in command of its troop, and so on and so on. Verse 29. Moses said to Chovav, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place of which the Lord had said, I will give it to you. Come with us, we'll be generous with you, for the Lord has promised to be generous to Israel. So we have, among other things, the puzzle of the names of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. And let me just read to you what Alter says about this. To verse 29. And Moses said to Chovav, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, we now leave the priestly tabulations and pomp and ceremony and enter the first actual narrative episode in the book of Numbers. The name of Moses' Midianite father-in-law is a bafflement that has been resolved only by rather contorted, harmonizing explanations. Okay. In Exodus, he is called Jethro, who also seems to be identical with Reuel. While here, he is Chovav, the son of Reuel. It seems like, so far he seems to have three names, Jethro, Reuel, and Chovav, and there's one more name that he has, Yeter, which is a shortened form of Yitro. Okay? So Jethro has four names in the Bible. It seems likely, Alter goes on to say, that these narratives draw on authentic ancient traditions about an alliance and a kinship between Moses and the Kenite clan of the Midianites. Interesting. So these stories are a kind of residue of what may seem to be historical background. And those traditions provide an etiological explanation, an explanation based on origins of something subsequent, for the peaceful cohabitation of the Kenites with the Israelites, about which we read in the book of Judges. Okay? You see what he's saying here? That these stories in the 5 books of Moses about Jethro, who's got various names, is a way of establishing a foundation, a raison d'etre of why they are dwelling peacefully together once they enter the promised land. That's an interesting thought process. In the traditional variations of these stories about the Kenites, Moses' father-in-law may have been assigned different names. So how do we understand the different names? Different stories, different traditions, different sources of this relationship between Moses and Jethro. So it's another way, in a way, it's another good example of how the Bible must have been put together from sources that preceded it, mediated by the thought processes of the editors down through the ages. Jim?
I always thought Chovav was his brother-in-law, not his father-in-law, the way it's worded.
Chovav was Moses' brother-in-law.
Yeah, because it says, because not only here, but it says in some other reading, said Jehoav, son of Reuel the Midianite. Reuel, Jethro, etc., was a very high-ranking
priest,
chief of the Midianites. And it's also interesting if you go just a teeny bit further, where he says, I will return to my native land, because they have a land, all these other groups have a land. The Israelites don't. They're wandering, and we still are.
Okay. Okay. And you're contrasting this with Jethro, who has a native land. Is that your point?
The point was, my point is, the Israelites, yeah, here they're wandering through the desert. They really don't have any permanent place, but they have to get along with these people on the way. And Midianites were extremely friendly, but it happens to be Moses' family, which may get back to Candy's question, what happened to his children? Maybe they went with their mother's family. Who knows?
Yeah, okay, good point. You're pointing to the amicable relationships between these two groups, illustrated by the family connections and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jethro was extremely influential
Gosh,
in
Exodus.
Moses' handling.
Right. He tells Moses to establish a kind of judiciary so that he doesn't have to handle all the cases. So Moses learns Torah from Jethro, we might say.
Yeah, because apparently Jethro was a very qualified administrator.
Looks that way. Patty?
I was gonna make the same point, the way that I read the first line of 29, is the Hobab is actually the brother-in-law, because Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law,
Okay,
would refer to
good.
Ruel, not Hobab.
Ron?
Do we ever have a resolution of chapter 30, where Hobab, who we now think is the son-in-law, pardon me, a brother-in-law rather, says, no, I'm not going to go, I'm going to go back to my own land. And Moses says to him, please, don't leave us in as much as you know the territory, you can kind of guide us on our way, and the Lord will share with you the bounty as he will share it with us, period. There's never a resolution
Right.
of that question.
We don't know. He says, I want to go back, and I guess we can assume he goes back.
Or not.
Or not. Yeah, the story leaves off before really a resolution. But notice, by the way, an interesting kind of parallel. So in the Hebrew, verse 30, Vayomer elav, and he said to him, Lo elech, I will not go with you. Ki'im el artzi ve'el moladati, I will go back to my land and my birthplace. When we go back to the story of Abraham in chapter 12, exactly those same two words are used. And God said, chapter 12 of Genesis, God said to Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, from your land. Chovav says, artzi, I'll go to my land. Umimoladtecha, your birthplace. So Abraham is asked to leave his land and his birthplace. Chovav is saying, I'm going to go back to my land and my birthplace. In a way, it's an illustration of Jim's point. Abraham represents departure, adventure, leaving, traveling, whereas Chovav represents the desire for return and stability. And in a way, it highlights the adventure of the Israelites, as Jim says to this very day, this notion of being on a journey. We may talk about it in terms of the spiritual journey and so on, but the Jewish people have been on the way. Malcolm?
2 points. It seems to me that Moses' role has changed from becoming more I guess I'll say a political and civic leader.
Okay, then.
As we establish the role of Aaron and the priestly class.
Uh-huh.
So he's still, we can still imagine him as a prophet, but his role, his importance to the people is now in guiding them through this real world journey.
Yeah.
So it's a more tangible and present physical world matter. I guess the other thing which to me relates to this, so you pointed out that this year and 30 days, when it appeared that the Israelites were near to the promised land, is going to turn out to be a journey of 40 years.
Yes.
Doesn't that really reflect our contemporary life experience?
That what?
life is a journey, as we, and that it is about the journey, it's not about the arriving.
It's an interesting point. So let me reformulate your point here. It looks as if the arrival is imminent. But in fact, the imminence of the arrival is transformed into the prolonged journey. So that you're inferring from this that the Torah is intimating that arrivals, we might be suspicious about arrivals, that in fact the true adventure is the journey to an arrival. Yeah. And even to take it one step further, when they do arrive and arrival happens, a new journey is undertaken. I describe it this way, that they arrive at the promised land, but they still have to create the promise of the promised land. So Jim's point again, I mean, in a variety of ways, it's about the adventure. Yeah, I guess that's true. Right. Yeah. What happens at the very end of the Bible? They arrive. Well, the very end of the Bible is that Cyrus gives the go-ahead for them to go back, and it says here that the Israelites vaya'al, and they returned. They went up, and in a way, it's part one of the new adventure. Yeah.
Don't we say in the weekly service, life is a journey and death is a destination?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. A going and a, however we read that. Right. Right. Okay. Russell.
So today's discussion on this, got me thinking, is there a negative aspect to Moses' relationship with and reliance on his father-in-law? Because he says, don't leave because you know where we should camp in the wilderness. Well, doesn't God know where they should camp in the wilderness? They've been showing them where to camp, where not to camp, when to go. And to me, that could be problematic.
What's the problem? What's problematic?
Well, Moses isn't trusting God anymore, just like when he whacked the rock and instead of talk to it, he says, oh, no, to another person, we need you to show us the way.
Right. Right. So that's the point that we were illustrating a few minutes ago, that there's this kind of tension between God leading the group and human beings leading the group. But we've had this notion before, haven't we? We could call it the Promethean moment in biblical religion. Prometheus, of course, is punished for storming the heavens. Moses is not. Somehow challenging God, as Moses does often, isn't seen as the kind of sin it is in the Greek mythology about Prometheus. But remember, after the golden calf, when Moses, in a way, has to teach God what God ought to be doing next. God wants to destroy the people. And Moses says to him, wait a minute, think about it. Let's stop. Don't act rashly. Let's sit down and think about it. What are the Egyptians going to say when they hear that you have destroyed this people in the wilderness? This is a malevolent God who brought them out not to redeem them, but in order to kill them. Don't you think that is going to look bad for you if you do this? And by the way, don't you remember that you made a covenant with the ancestors and you promised them certain things? You can't go back on your promises. And God essentially says to Moses, you know, you're right. So I think that's a great example of human initiative even against God. So it's kind of human initiative taken to a very, very high level. So I think you're right. I think we have here an implicit, it's not made explicit, tension between God-driven activity and human-driven activity here. when Moses says the next chapter after, God is going to lead us, you know where we're going to camp. So I think that tension is palpable and quite fascinating, Jim, but not surprising, because when you think about, look, there are at least two different kinds of covenant, right? There's a covenant of promise, which is unilateral. I promise to give you the land forever. You don't have to do anything to deserve it. That's a one-way promise. Then there's the bilateral covenant, where each party has obligations. I mean, what we're seeing here, and I think throughout, is yes, God's fidelity to God's promises, but also that human beings are God's covenantal partner, whom God has to take with the utmost seriousness. So we really have both, don't we? We have a dual causality throughout. Jim?
But that underlines the humanity part of the situation. The Midianites are an established society, people. The Egyptians were an established people. And so Moses is trying to make his own society here.
Yeah.
So it's natural he would ask another person who's already done it. I mean, it shows the infancy of the Israelites.
Okay, it's a good point. It's a good point. And remember, in the first chapters of the Bible, we already have in chapter 11, I think, a list of the various nations that seem already to be deeply underway, including the Babylonians in some way or another, building the Tower of Babel. Yeah, right. That's a good point. And I think Malcolm's point, just to come back to it, about the change in Moses' role. What you've really suggested is that early on, Moses is kind of an emissary of God. So he's involved, let me just put it this way, vertically, between heaven and earth. Now his orientation seems to be much more horizontal. Power, dealing with issues on the ground, trying to keep the enterprise going when it's going to falter over and over again. I mean, we have the renegades who say we want to go back to Egypt, the land, they call it the land of milk and honey, and Moses has to find a way to keep the thing going. So I think it's a good point. Maimonides' Moses is both prophet and sage, the greatest mind that ever lived, that Moses really had great intimacy with God. There is this medieval notion of the active intellect, which is really kind of an offshoot of God, which knows everything, and that we human beings, through knowledge, through an acquired intellect, gain intimacy with the active intellect and come to know more and more and to be like that which we're emulating. There, Moses, according to Maimonides, actualized his intellect more than any other person who has ever lived. A philosopher, politician, prophet. We don't see that here. We see Moses as a very practical human being trying to deal with issues on the ground. Patty?
The thing I like about Moses the most is he's sort of held up as our example of why you should designate so much of your life or devote your life to something bigger than you are that's not necessarily going to be accomplished within your lifetime. You might not see the end point or success. And I didn't really start thinking about it in this way until I saw that documentary a few years ago about Lemkin. I just had to go look up his last name, who came up with the term for genocide. And there was a documentary called Watchers of the Sky, and he talked about how he just would stand outside the United Nations, and he came up with this word and this idea saying we should not allow countries to have the authority, so much authority over their own people that they can kill them. And that sort of started a new concept in international law that, we shouldn't allow other countries to kill off the Uyghurs or the Jews. And the arc of his story was that he devoted his life to this idea that he felt so strongly about, knowing that probably within his lifetime it would never take hold, but it really was instrumental in the way that we consider power in the world now. And that I always think about Moses and Lincoln and his story.
Devoting himself to an idea, an ideal, the culmination of which he's not going to see, likely not to see, right?
And that should be, we should all fix something. Climate change, we're not going to fix climate change in our lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's a good
But
point.
why turn away from something that big?
Yeah. Somebody once made the comment about love your neighbor as yourself, that its primary idea is somebody exists outside of me. And that's the idea you're suggesting, that there is something outside of me that requires deference, activity from me to serve it. I've got to treat my neighbor in a certain way, since my neighbor transcends me, not necessarily in value, but being different. And I can serve my neighbor. It's not quite analogous.
And now that's starting to take hold, that we owe something to the futures, like to actually start thinking strongly about the people coming in the future, and instead of just this arbitrary, we're so into the present. But I've been reading about that. A lot of people are talking about philosophers about that idea of
Obligation.
giving that population the respect and deference.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. And that is Moses, who is on the path. Gary?
My only coda to your point is that Moses was a reluctant leader. He took the mantle very hesitantly, but he took it at God's request.
Yep, right.
So again, God is the center of this whole picture.
Right. I was just reading a piece in the New Yorker about Mozart. I don't know whether you've seen it. Lovely essay. And he's making the point here that one of Mozart's great gifts and contributions was not only elegant, lovely, beautiful, energized music, but inwardness. Mozart is able to depict the inner life of his characters. And this is what you're pointing to, too, that one can raise a leader's prestige idea very, very high until one recognizes the human cost of taking on something like what Patty is describing or what Moses undertook. So the Torah, I think to its great credit, is also interested in inwardness or ambivalence. And why wouldn't a leader have some ambivalence? There are costs to leadership, not only in terms of whether you can please all the people that you're asked to lead, but whether you feel up to the task, and so on. So we shouldn't think that greatly. Think of Lincoln in terms of inwardness and ambivalence, but nevertheless he pushed on. And in a way, in that sense, that I guess one of the reasons why Lincoln is seen as our greatest or one of the greatest leaders, because he does wonderful things, but at a great cost to himself in terms of the ambivalence that he undoubtedly felt. Yeah, right. Yeah, Moses' reluctance, and of course many of the prophets are reluctant. Isaiah says, who, me? Choose somebody else if you would, please. Jeremiah, for sure, is the reluctant prophet. It almost is inherent in the very notion of prophecy or leadership. you're bound to run into some problems. Scott?
In extension of what Patty said about Moses being a reluctant prophet, dedicated to a cause that he never really saw the fulfillment of, so was the whole nation. They did that for whether they wanted to or not, they did that for the project, right?
He did that for?
The whole nation did that. In the whole sojourn, that generation never made it.
Oh.
Never made it.
Right, and what, I missed you.
The point is, the whole nation behaved similarly to Moses.
Uh-huh.
They were, in a way, unwilling participants. They didn't realize that they weren't going to reach this goal.
Right, but I
So
think.
they dedicated to it and took action. Sometimes they faltered, sometimes they.
Right. But I think Patty's point is that this is a function of, or an attribute of leadership, that the leader, often depending upon how great a task the leader has undertaken, that it's likely not to be fulfilled. The people don't fulfill it, but I'm not sure they had a vision.
No, they might not. That was one of the problems we discussed much earlier in Torah Study with Babel, right? They said they lost focus on the end project and therefore failed.
Right. Yeah, Ron, and then Vivian.
Isn't some of this answered and the argument about Moses' position put to rest in chapter 12? When we haven't gotten it yet, but reading ahead, when Aaron and Miriam and Moses are called to a secret little conference, and God says to the three of them, look, I speak mouth to mouth
Right.
to Moses.
Right.
I speak in visions and riddles to all others.
Yeah.
So it's Moses who is the direct line for me. Pay attention to him, fantasize about the others.
Yes. And why do you raise that at this moment?
Well, because we're talking about Moses' position of authority.
Huh.
And is he still the vertical, the direct pipeline to God?
Yes.
Or has he now become more of a political figure? I think the answer is he is always the direct pipeline.
Right, great. But this, I think the focus here is on, just to generalize it, the jealousy, the envy that others may have of the leader, especially those close to the leader. And another problem for a leader, what is the phrase? The king never rests completely during the night, something like that. How does that go? So, what would you say? Oh, yeah, that's right, exactly. So this is a problem of the lack of full acceptance of the leader on the part of others who have some credentials to be leaders. I mean, after all, they're siblings of Moses. Aaron is the high priest, and so on and so on. Yeah, so I think what you're pointing to is the difficulties that the leader faces in being the leader. Not only doubt from the inside, but doubt from the outside as well.
Well, I think another evidence of your point is the fact that Moses and his cadre never really seemed to have control of the people.
That's a good point, yeah.
Those people go along for a little while and then they get fed up again.
Yeah.
They go along for a little while and they get fed up again.
All right.
And we need another show of force to bring them back into the fold, as it were.
Right. Well, that may be a function of how enormous the task really is. To make it through, just to speak in mythological terms, to make it through wilderness to the fulfillment of promise. Maybe as Jim points out, as Malcolm points out, do we ever really fulfill the promise in its fullness? So the difficulties of the journey, I think, illustrate the difficulty of arrival, of really getting there. And poor Moses is put in charge of the whole thing. Yeah. Terry Francona may be the Moses of... how the heck is he going to pull this off? He's got a bunch of rebellious guys. Don't want to swing the bat. Oh, just an aside. Vivian?
Back to the metaphor of leader and whether it's vertical or horizontal.
Yeah.
And both of you touched upon the word of the vision. Moses was also visionary, looking towards the future,
Yeah.
always. Whether he started off as visionary, no, but he becomes that at Sinai. He
Yeah,
becomes,
yeah.
And you cannot escape a vision if you're a visionary.
Okay.
You cannot deny it, and you just keep going forward. It is just locked and loaded in your brain and in your emotion and in all motivation.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that fits with the prophet that he is considered to be.
Right, but notice in the next chapter, chapter 11, which we'll begin with next week, and verse 11 of chapter 11. Well, let's start with 10. Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart, each person at the entrance of his tent. The Lord was very angry, and Moses was distressed. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant, with me? And why have I not enjoyed your favor, that you have laid the burden of all this people upon me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I bear them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries an infant to the land that you have promised on the oath to their fathers?" I mean, look what you put me up to here. I didn't bear them. This wasn't my idea. So yes, the visionary has the vision, but in parallel to what we've been saying for a while here, there's the other side too, the discouragement, the despair. I mean, I think Patty's notion of somebody who has a big vision and is working on it and recognizes that it will never be, likely not to be fulfilled in his or her lifetime. There must be the dark nights of the soul, as well as the grandeur of the idea to which this person is devoted. Am I wrong to think that these are novelistic, or let's say more generally, literary elements in this biblical text? I mean, after all, doesn't the novel really begin in the post-Renaissance period, or maybe in the Renaissance period, when the idea of the individual, when humanism begins to emerge here as an important element in understanding reality? And here we have novelistic elements which trace the psychological career of a person devoted to something in the public sphere. Yeah, right. And that's, Alter, who wrote the very important book, what's the name of that book, which begins the whole school of the literary studies of the Bible. What's the name of that book? Anybody remember? Why can't I think this morning about it? Jeffrey? Did you have a comment?
I did. The ambivalence that we see in the reluctance of prophets and Moses, I think, is relevant if you view this as a teaching manual about how to live. Things are hard. Yeah. And to Patty's point, you do them anyway. We may not solve climate change. We may not realize everything in here. But even Moses was reluctant, and yet he went forward.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, all the prophets did it anyway. If everybody is an enthusiastic leader, and you're at a time when you don't have enthusiastic leaders, you may say, to heck with this.
Yeah.
So I think the human element of fear, reluctance, helps us understand that there will be times when we look to this even when we don't want to.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's an important point. I mean, one of the things people talk about traditionally of why read the Bible is it is a kind of manual. Be like Abraham, be like Jacob, be like Moses. Be like Moses would therefore convey to us that it's not easy to be Moses. But your point, but Moses persists. I've always thought that one of the greatest words in the lexicon of mature religions or mature societies or cultures is nevertheless. In spite of what we are confronted with, we move on. I made this comment last night. You know, at the end of a service, we recite the Shechianu, in which we express gratitude for our blessings. And I said something like, being a little personal about it, you know, I've had difficulties today. It's a little harder for me to get up. The arthritis, I can get down pretty easily, but it's harder to get up. I'm not moving as fast on the tennis court. But nevertheless, we're going to recite the Shechianu and express gratitude for our blessings, and are all the more poignant and powerful when we recognize and reckon with the difficulties that make gratitude harder. But nevertheless, we need to express our gratitude for the good, as we're pointing out about Moses, as a sort of a model for facing difficulties but moving on. Stuart.
Perhaps the greatest example of all that is Jonah, who flees rather than confront the people of Nineveh with their sins, and has to be rewarded, if you will, by God with the story about the gourd.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Although, I don't know, is Jonah a nevertheless kind of person? He's sort of dragged back into the mission, isn't he, by God?
Yeah.
And does he ever resolve himself? He's got a good point, by the way. You're a forgiving God, and you're going to forgive the Ninevites. So what am I doing representing your justice when there will be no justice because God forgives? So it looks like nothing has happened. So Jonah's in a sort of anti-type in a way.
Well,
yeah.
I think Joseph is...
Joseph or Jonah?
Jonah.
Jonah.
Excuse me. Is an example of that.
Yes.
Because God forgives, but only after the king of Nineveh has placed himself in sackcloth and ashes.
Right. And don't the cows repent as well? Something about and the cows?
Yeah.
How the book ends? Yeah, okay, all right. Good. So, where are we? We've just, and we're about to stop, but we're now in chapter 10. We have looked at 29 through 32, the Chovav situation, or the Ruel, and he's going to return to his native land. And then verse 33, they move on. They march to the mountain, and then we have that very puzzling but exciting verse 35. When the ark was set out, Moses would say, "Advance, O Lord." If you have the Hebrew, you can see that there are what are called inverted nuns around verses 35 and the end of 36, those two verses. An inverted nun, that's what they're called here. There's a footnote here, Simanit Menozeret, the bracketed symbols are known as nun hafucha, the inverted nun. But really what they most likely are brackets. They look like brackets. And the Greek literary people who work with text often put sigma and antisigma around the Greek letter sigma as brackets. That's what these probably are, which are quite fascinating because the scripture, the rabbis sometimes say that these two verses, chapter 10, 35 and 36, the brackets indicate that they don't belong here in the natural flow. And so they have been inserted into this passage, which after all begins the Torah service, doesn't it, now in the traditional synagogue. And some of the rabbis called these two verses a separate book. In a way, it's got power to it on its own. Advance, O Lord, as we are now advancing. From which these rabbis infer that there are really 7 books of the Torah. 3 books contained in the book of Numbers, right? Before 10:35, 35 and 36, and after 35 and 36. So you have not just one book of Numbers, but 3 books of Numbers, adding 2 books of the 5 books of Moses. There are really 7 books. No, this is just playing with it. But it does emphasize here the kind of the singular power of these 2 verses as a kind of ritual. It's a sort of biblical poetry. There's repetition and meter and so on. So we'll take a good look at it next week. And then with chapter 11, we begin the narrative again in earnest as we move toward the climax where finally the ultimate rebel is Moses himself. Malcolm?
Just to go full circle on your counting, the plural of senses is census. It is the 4th declension.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, good. And what's the plural of census?
I say census.
Censuses? Census.
That's where you started this.
Right. Exactly. No. There's another equus, I think, is horse, isn't it? And yeah. Oh, I know. The word that always gets me is hiatus, an interruption. What's the plural of hiatus? Well, it's hiatuses, colloquially. But I think it's hiatus, because the plural of a 4th declension noun is itself. How many Torah studies in the history of humanity have ever mentioned a 4th declension Latin noun? How great, how great. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Glad to see you back.
Oh, okay.
Spending lots of time in Cleveland. I'm leaving at tomorrow to tend to my garden and do stuff, but I'll be back.
Looks like you're moving forward,
There's something to that. Yeah, it's recent months when we'll talk we have time. Have been very interesting.
I did talk.
Focus.
And so I
We have the tour this thing in Anchor. There's like, I don't want to call it a purpose because I didn't think of it as a purpose in the later years. But there's a certain unsteadiness. Like, what am I doing? What should I do? Should is a bad thing. What might I be doing to contribute to the world? There's sort of an existential crisis question. It was, well, that's a complicated question. It was 41 years of doing that. Recently, the nature of
Oh, well,
our practice, like the nature of medicine, has changed.
no, but all right.
My own internist was retiring, said this to me 2 weeks ago. It's less satisfying than it used to be for people who are interested in the intellectual profession. Practice of law or medicine. So I don't think that a lot of there's stuff to do. We just had this fabulous tour, which kept me engaged. And now it's, okay, how do I use whatever skill, talent, interests I have in organize
The more satisfying, the
Oh.
more vacuum, so to speak. Weren't you thinking about working with the
That is in New York. It's a whole other discussion. There was an issue about appointing someone to the university without having a national security. My friend wanted me to come. Doris, I just want to catch Doris before she leaves. And the dean, he wanted me to come and work with him on a case. And we've known each other for 40 years. But it became a bit of an issue how you appoint people to the staff. It's in limbo at the moment.
I have a napkin here, I can scribble it on.
But you would
Oh, yeah. The advantage to this was it's an issue I know something about one time. More than the person I love. He was my mentor. Long-standing very devoted, quite reflective. We have a lot to talk about. But I want to work with people like him. And that's not easy to find. It's not easy to find.
Oh,
no, my gosh.
I could do it. I'm also, in some ways, more interested in working in music, in art.
You have that as well.
I have that as well. I've been working on some performers. That express themselves. I mean, this is sort of ad hoc. I'm not doing it. That appeals to me. Creative. So to the extent I can do that, excuse me.
That's another. I've always felt you wanted to catch Doris, didn't you?
Yeah, Doris, but I want to catch Doris here for 1 second.
So we'll talk more about it.
I was going to say hi, Doris. I'll be right back. All right.
Are you gonna join us?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, Jackie said to me recently, I think I've had you for a while. Fool, I said to her, fool. Well, Don Giovanni, I mean, I wasn't able to go, but it is a 3.5-hour hour with a couple of intermissions. It's close to 5 hours. That's a big commitment. There you go, another journey.
he needs somebody to take care of him.
Nobody do, she's,
Well, he's already told her that if, and you can never tell her to say this, but he's already told her that if she asks him to leave, she'll say, well, you know, it's terrible. So, and he doesn't, exactly. So she's gotten to the point where she used to have everybody come for dinner on Saturday night, and come to Thanksgiving, and so he's made it that she's not supposed to even say hello to these men who find her very attractive, and he said, or, and it's just really odd. So anyway, the point that I was going to say is, she said, they don't really have friends. I said, well, I've got all these people I can call and say, she said, but Mom, you make friends. Breaks fine. Breaks fine. And there's nothing I can do, because if I say something, she gets upset with me. So,
can't, she's made up her mind she's gonna do this, and
well,
that's what
she
she's.
took him on, and now I think she would like not to have taken him on. That's where she is now. And he's always playing, he's always growing and motivating.